defensive line, Mannerheim had created a buffer zone, some 20 to 45 kilometers deep, in which villages had been razed and booby-trapped, and mines had been planted. About 21,000 Finnish soldiers held strong points in this zone, their role to break up and disorganize Soviet formations before they reached the main defensive positions. In some places, this strategy worked. On the southwest coast, the Soviets ran into determined resistance before the village of Territorial, where Finnish companies counterattacked during the night of the 30th of November, 1st of December, and succeeded in retaking lost positions. But elsewhere, Finnish forces abandoned positions, sometimes on the merest rumour that the Russians were approaching. On the 4th of December, a furious Mannerheim stormed into General Osterman's HQ, demanding that the forces in the buffer zone offer firmer resistance to the Soviet advance. Osterman, who regarded the buffer zone policy as too risky for Finland's semi-trained troops, offered his resignation, which Mannerheim refused to accept. Had the Soviets reached the Mannerheim Line at this time, they may have triggered a major crisis in the Finnish ranks. But the Russians advanced sluggishly, their massive mechanized columns immobilized for hours at a time in huge traffic jams. It was not until the 6th of December that Soviet forward units reached the line, and not until the 8th of December that artillery and ammunition had been brought forward in significant quantities. By this time, Mannerheim was receiving alarming reports from all along Finland's 1,000-kilometre frontier with the USSR north of Lake Ladoga. A fairly developed road and rail system ran along the northern shore of the lake, and along this advanced 3 Soviet divisions, far more than Mannerheim had thought the Soviets could logistically sustain. Here, there was no defence line. The defending troops, Finland's 4th Corps, too weak to hold ground, had to rely on a mobile defence. Finnish sappers blew up a dam on Lake Sujärvi, about 16 kilometres northeast of Ladoga, which flooded the Soviets' main line of advance for a few hours before the water froze. On the 3rd of December, the Finns attempted a counterattack, but the sudden appearance of Russian tanks stopped them in their tracks. They disengaged hurriedly and withdrew to the western bank of the Aitujaki River. The next day, the Soviets crossed in strength, pushing the Finns back to the road junction at Tolvajärvi, from where it was possible that the Soviets might come around the north of Lake Ladoga and take the Mannerheim Line from the rear. Further north still, the Soviet 163rd and 44th Divisions ground along tracks and logging roads towards the main north-south highway junction at Suomussalmi, a town with a peacetime population of about 4,000. So certain was Mannerheim that the Soviets would not be able to operate in such a remote area that he had deployed only a few companies of border guards. The Soviets pushed them aside with ease. On the 7th of December, Soviet columns rolled into the straggling streets of Suomussalmi. From here, the Soviets were poised to advance west across the narrow waste of Finland and cut the country in half. With the exception of a naval reversal off Hanko, the first week of operations had gone well for the Soviets. It seemed that another week would secure victory. They were so confident, they established a new government in one of the villages they had liberated in the Karelian Isthmus, a government which was sure to be in Helsinki in the very near future. In Helsinki, by the end of the first week, many members of the government and several quite senior soldiers were close to despair. A younger, less experienced commander might well have succumbed to panic. But this was Mannerheim's 5th war, and he reviewed the growing crisis with icy calm. He'd been surprised by the sheer extent of the Soviet thrusts, but he knew that so many over such long distances would stretch Soviet logistics. Although Finnish forces everywhere had been driven back, a Soviet breakthrough had not been achieved. Mannerheim took prompt action. The commanding officer of 4th Corps, who'd been unable to prevent a near disaster north of Lake Ladoga, he replaced with Major General Waldemar Haglund, a veteran of the 27th Jaegers. He also redeployed his scarce resources, sending reinforcements to 4th Corps north of Lake Ladoga and to Suomussalmi. But he kept most of his reserves concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus. Finland could afford to give ground anywhere, but there. On the Karelian front, Meretskov knew that the Finns would concentrate their forces on the central west of the Mannerheim Line at Sumer, where a developed road and rail system ran northwest to Viipuri and then on to Helsinki. So he decided to attack first on the Finns' eastern flank, near the village of Taipale, where the Mannerheim Line met Lake Ladoga. Enough pressure here, Meretskov reasoned, would persuade the Finns to commit their reserves, at which point the Soviets would strike at Sumer. The first Russian probes crossed the Taipale River on the 6th of December and found the far bank apparently undefended. More battalions rushed forward to exploit what seemed to be a gap in the Mannerheim Line. However, all was not as it seemed. The hapless Russians advanced into a carefully prepared killing ground, covered by Finnish artillery and machine guns. The first waves of Russians were cut down in a torrent of fire. To the amazement of the Finns, the Russians kept pouring units into what was clearly a trap. They failed to understand Meretskop's strategy, which was to accept high casualties in order to engage the Finns in an attritional battle and draw their strength away from Sumer. Before dawn on the 14th of December, massed Soviet artillery opened up its first major bombardment of the war. At 11:30, the barrage lifted. Soviet tanks, accompanied by infantry in closely packed groups, moved forward. The Finns waited until the Russians reached pre-plotted firing lines and then opened up. Shrapnel tore through the dense masses of Soviet infantry, while tank after tank was hit. It took just 5 minutes to bring the Soviet attack to a halt and then send it staggering into retreat. Meretskov fed another 2 divisions into the battle and reinforced the artillery to 84 batteries. Although he had hoped for a breakthrough, he believed that the fighting was now of such intensity that it must have absorbed the Finnish reserve. That being so, it was time to alter the axis of attack. At 0500 on the 17th of December, Meretskov launched his main offensive against the Mannerheim Line at Sumer. Massed Soviet artillery opened up, and for 5 hours worked its way backwards and forwards across the Finnish positions. It was the heaviest artillery bombardment experienced anywhere in the world since those on the Western Front at the beginning of November 1918. Moving along corridors left untouched by the artillery, Soviet sappers swarmed forward, attempting to lift mines and clear obstacles. Behind them rumbled the tanks, accompanied at first by clumps of Russian infantry. But infantry and armor cooperation was poor. As the tanks pushed forward, the infantry were left behind, leaving gaps. Spotting their chance to exploit this weakness, Finnish machine gunners and mortar teams opened up on the infantry. The tanks rolled on alone to the line of granite anti-tank obstacles, their tracks biting into the rock monoliths and pushing the tanks skyward at a steep angle. At this point, the Finnish anti-tank teams struck. In some places, the crew of a Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun managed to get their solid 2-pound shells directly into the vulnerable bellies of the tanks, smashing the transmission or killing some of the crew. At many points in the Sumer sector, the Mannerheim Line was flanked by lakes, which were now frozen solid. As his frontal assaults against the line ground to a halt, Meretskov sent columns directly across the lakes, in the hope of outflanking the main defences. But the shores of the lakes were made up of jumbles of granite boulders, cliffs and dense forests. There were only a handful of exits from most lakes, which channeled the Russian advance. With carefully placed anti-tank guns and ambush parties, these exits were turned into killing grounds.